Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, fighting poverty. A decade ago, the United Nations came up with its Millenium Goals. Are they working? Can they work? The evidence in Indonesia seems to suggest no. But while some countries struggle, Bangladesh's women, they're doing it for themselves, changing the face of construction and the entire economy. Plus an oil discovery at the top of the world. Will it be a blessing or a curse for Greenland and its way of life? But let's start with this goal of halving global poverty and hunger by the year 2015, which I would remind you is just a touch over 4 years away. A noble aim it was, put forward as part of the United Nations Millenium Development Goals, but as they're finding out 10 years on, it is one that requires a lot more commitment. According to the UN's own numbers, 925 million people around the world suffer from chronic hunger. 2/3 of the world's hungry, that's more than 600 million of them, live in just 7 countries. And it's in one of those countries where we begin this week, Indonesia, where more than half the population, 120 million people, live on just $2 a day. Step Varsen with this from Jakarta.
The bustling heart of Jakarta, just a kilometer away from the presidential palace. This is home to Rosdiana Silalahi, not one of many fancy apartments that have been built over the years. Her house is a hole under the bridge. Extreme poverty, safely kept away from the public eye. The dark side of an emerging city, squeezing its citizens to their limits. Her self-made house is an oversized coffin under the bridge, next to a stinking river. This is where she has lived for the past 5 years.
I used to be quite wealthy, but my husband was a gambler and lost all our money. I got really stressed. My husband died soon after, and that's how I ended up here.
Away from the public eye and the dirtiest corners of town, there's another city. A city underneath the real city, where people are scrambling to survive, ignored by the government. These are the invisible citizens of Indonesia. This is their world. This is where they cook if they have money for food. Sometimes they eat only once or twice a day. This is also where they wash their clothes and themselves. If the river reaches dangerous levels, this is where they hide. Tens of thousands of people live in Jakarta's invisible city. Despite all the poverty eradication programs, their lives have remained untouched.
Survival system orang miskin.
We can see that the survival system of poor people is getting less strong. They are used to being chased around for many years, and they always survived. But now we see more and more people committing suicide or getting mentally ill. This means resistance of poor people to cope with their situation is going down.
Rosiana earns money by being a jockey. She's being picked up by drivers to be the extra passenger in a car during rush hour, obeying government regulations. Her friends do dirty work for a few dollars each day. To them, Millennium Development Goals are words from a different planet, although Indonesia has managed to make some progress.
I think, the performance hasn't been as great as people would have hoped for, but there's been kind of a steady decline in the number of people who are, below the government's own national poverty line or even the World Bank's $1.25 a day line.
For those who have not been reached, life is at times unbearable.
So the argument there could be that a grand plan like the UN's Millennium Goals doesn't necessarily work. It's a great idea, make no mistake, but the problem is clearly very big. It needs very specific attention in very specific areas. Which brings us to the point that poverty is just one of those specific areas. The Millennium Goals cover a lot more. The details on those with Salma Al-Shahat now in our London Broadcast Centre.
Thanks. That's right. Another goal is to ensure all boys and girls get a complete primary school education. While more than 50 poor countries have achieved this aim, 38 mostly African countries are unlikely to meet the target. In Kenya, progress has been made, with more than 1.5 million children who were previously out of school have now been enrolled in the last 7 years. But poverty still prevents thousands more from going to school, as Catherine Soy reports from northeastern Kenya.
9-year-old Sophia Sineno is starting her day in Garissa, northeastern Kenya, one of the poorest regions in the country. Her grandfather cannot walk, and it's her duty to make sure that he's well fed, clean, and with a healthy blood circulation.
When I wake up, I wash the dishes, clean the compound, then help my grandfather take his bath. I have to massage him every day to keep his blood flowing. After that, I go to cut grass, which I sell.
She also lives here with her mother and 2 younger siblings. The family has already lost 2 children to malaria. One died last month. Sophia has never been to a classroom.
When I go to look for casual work, Sophia is the only one who can help with the children and my father. We alternate on who stays home and who goes to work. If we don't do that, we won't eat.
Basic education is now free in Kenya. Since the introduction in 2003, more than 1.5 million children who were previously out of school have been enrolled. But poverty has prevented thousands of others in rural areas from going to school. Instead, many, like Sophia, have been forced to stay at home, take care of the family, and work. In many rural areas, feeding programs have been introduced to keep poor children in school. Here, the program is a lifeline. The incentive for many children to come to school is this food. Food meant for 1 child per serving, but most times shared by families. Madina Yakub takes food home from school to her grandmothers and younger brother. Her father is dead, and her mother, who is mentally unstable, is hardly ever around. Kenya has made strides towards meeting Millennium Development Goal targets like free education, alleviating some poverty and combating malaria. But the UN office charged with monitoring progress in the continent says that the pace is too slow.
Kenya is a wealthy country. It has more assets and capital than, say, Chad. Kenya is doing poorer than the smallest countries, Lesotho, Burkina Faso, in terms of how the economy impacts on the average quality of life of the average Kenyan.
Sophia and Madina are at the bottom of the poverty line, and by the deadline may not be reached by many of the goals set out in 2001. They represent a vulnerable group that experts say should now be at the top of any government's priority list in this final 5 years.
Joining me now from outside the United Nations in New York is ActionAid's Chief Executive Joanna Kerr. Joanna, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we've just seen that 38 countries, mostly in Africa, have failed to meet their primary school enrollment targets. Does that mean that the Millennium Development Goals have failed to spur on the kind of development that's needed by these countries?
I think we'd be able to agree with that. In fact, we're recognizing that, in fact, it's costing poor countries $450 billion a year in terms of lost productivity, loss of education, loss of health because of hunger. In fact, almost 1 billion people still live in chronic hunger. And this is probably the most urgent goal that governments need to be addressing in order to be tackling all of the other MDG goals.
Now, Joanna, I'll ask you a bit of a technical question here. How did you calculate that 450 billion figure?
Yeah, not to get too technical, this is based on UN figures where one can calculate the kind of loss of productivity of hunger, loss of health, loss of education. And so we aggregated that figure. And what the UN has been saying is that to speed up on the hunger goal, that governments only need to be spending $40 billion a year to tackle chronic hunger. Our calculation says it's costing $450 billion, which is 1/10. So in other words, pay the money now or it's going to cost $10 billion later.
Do you think the financial crisis...
10 times more later.
Do you think the financial crisis is going to make it much worse for countries now to actually come up with that money?
Well, you know, that's a lot of the excuses that we're hearing inside, that the financial crisis has slowed this down. But to be honest, there are lots of very innovative solutions on the table. A very tiny tax of 0.05% to banks and financial institutions that could leverage literally billions of dollars to tackle hunger, to tackle climate change. So there are possibilities. And let's not forget that $15 trillion was mobilized to save the banking institutions in this country alone. So if we really had the political will, we could find the money.
I suppose another possibility is the fact that we could allow African countries and African farmers to trade their way out of poverty rather than rely on aid.
Well, one thing that we've recognized through our work with local farmers and women farmers is that in fact there are solutions out of poverty. And those countries that have invested in small-scale agriculture, support for local farmers, particularly women farmers, who produce 60 to 80% of the food in the poorest countries, they actually have been able to have real successes in tackling hunger and poverty. So, quite honestly, we could meet the hunger goal if we allowed countries to invest far more in local agriculture.
But Joanna, isn't the problem though, is even if they do produce more agriculture, the problem will be in the marketplace because they've got so many quotas, so many tariffs against them imposed upon them by developed countries such as the European Union and America.
Yes, certainly, and we understand that in fact it costs poor countries, I think, about $30 billion a year in terms of what agricultural subsidies for farmers in the north. But we were very happy to hear the World Bank say yesterday that it's time now to actually relook at the kind of tariffs and mechanisms that really discriminate against poor people in developing countries.
Now, a big criticism of the Millennium Development Goals has been the fact that it focuses so much on aid, when many other people would say that maybe your organization's central message should be pushing for more trade, for more private sector growth. What do you say to that?
Well, I think similar to that, the criticism of the MDGs is that, you know, they're taken out of the context of corporate globalization, the ways in which economies really function. It is still very much based on somewhat of a charity model. So our organization, ActionAid, and many others are saying, you know, to what extent is poverty really created by a global economic system that continues to ensure that rich people get richer and poor people get poorer? So we're hoping that... Go ahead.
No, I'm saying that's a very fair point, because what we're seeing now is that poverty has become widespread. America only last week has given us figures to show that poverty is on the increase and that 43.6 million Americans today are living in poverty. So do we need Millennium Goals also for developed countries?
In fact, we need the Millennium Development Goals to understand inequalities within countries. So India is another perfect case in point, where you have now something like 55 billionaires in India, yet almost half the children in India are extremely undernourished. So in fact, we cannot no longer really talk about just rich nations and poor nations. We actually have to talk about rich communities and poor communities and how to address injustice and inequality overall.
Joanna Kerr, thank you so much for joining us.
When counting the cost returns, more on the UN Millennium Goals, this time the flip side from Bangladesh. Plus, we're looking for oil in Greenland.
About 150 kilometres out at sea, a Scottish company is searching for oil. Oil that could change the future of this island forever.
Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your weekly business stop right here on Al Jazeera. Let's continue now with our look at the UN's Millennium Goals. You know, we've talked a lot about goals that aren't being met, but there are, of course, some success stories out there. Take the role of women in Bangladesh. The country is racing ahead of many of its neighbours when it comes to one of the UN's Millennium Goals, that of gender equality. And the results can be seen not just in communities, but in the whole economy. Nicholas Haak explains for us.
Some might consider this a man's job, but not in Bangladesh, where women working in the construction sector is common. It's heavy, dirty and tough. With no machinery, only simple tools, it took a year for Rahima and her colleagues to build this 1 mile long dirt road that links their village with a highway.
It's hard work. We don't get paid much, but with the money that I make, I've sent my kids to school and paid for my daughter's wedding.
Like many of these women, Rahima was abandoned by her husband. He went abroad to work and never came back, leaving her on her own to take care of the 3 children. In the past, her community would have shunned her, but this has changed because now she's able to support her family with her own work. But not just her family is benefiting here.
Women are multipliers. If you support women, you will support a whole family. It's not only that you support an individual. Benefits that you will bring to women, they will translate into lifting a whole family out of poverty.
According to the World Bank, women's participation in the labor force has doubled in the last 10 years. Today, no less than half of all women are working.
In this Muslim-majority country, it's in the parliament that there's the most visible change. 64 elected members of parliament are women. Now that's 1/3 of all the seats, whereas in a country like the United States, only 15% of the elected body is made up of women.
But this change is a forced change, the result of a quota system. In fact, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has increased the quota of female members of parliament to 100, and 4 of the cabinet ministers holding key portfolios are women. Dipu Muni is one of them. She's the country's first female foreign minister.
When I visit other countries, because of the misconception about Islam, they think that women here are subjugated. But we had Muslim rulers at different levels who were women. Women have always played very effective roles in decision-making, in politics.
And the numbers speak for themselves. As more women join the workforce, the economy continued to expand. The latest numbers show the economy here growing by 6% a year, a pace many countries in the world can only aspire to.
Now, before we leave the idea of goals, just something else I want to throw in the ring, because you can't assume that poverty and living below adequate amounts of income only happens in poor countries. It doesn't, and it gets tougher as life goes on. I want you to consider this, a report on adequate amounts of money for retirement, which argues Europeans will need to collectively save around $2.3 trillion to retire on 70% of their salaries. That's what the OECD calls adequate. Or look at it another way. In the UK, the average income equates to around $54,000. But you take out tax, your mortgage or rent payments, your living expenses, it does not leave you with very much. And this same report reckons Britons need to save $16,100 a year each to live at that adequate level in retirement. Just something to remember when you think about goal setting. It is for everyone, not just those defined as the most needy. Couple of stories in brief for you now. Larry Summers, one of the architects of the US economic recovery, has decided to step down as President Obama's top economic advisor. Summers apparently wants to return to his teaching job at Harvard University. Fair enough. But he is the 3rd top economic official to leave the Obama administration. The Wall Street Journal said Summers had wanted the Treasury Secretary's job, a post he held under President Clinton, but was instead appointed a White House advisor. We got reaction from Gary Wasserman, who is professor of political science at Georgetown University here in Doha.
You know, when you have a losing football team, you can't fire the owner. So the next best thing is to fire your leading players. And Summers suffered from being both identified with Harvard and an economist. As Harvard, he could be seen as a kind of a liberal elitist out of touch with Main Street. And as an economist, he's not a businessman. And so Wall Street, even though he worked on Wall Street, could see him as not understanding business and business problems.
And still in the US, a sign of the times. It used to be when you wanted to watch a movie at home, you'd head down to the local video store. Not so much, though, in this new digital world. And the victim of that is Blockbuster Video, perhaps the best-known video rental chain in the United States and beyond, which has filed for what's known as Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Now, that doesn't mean it's going under, but its debts are so high, around $1 billion, that it needs to restructure in order to survive. It'll do that thanks to bondholders who hold around 80% of the company. Blockbuster's been in decline for some time, fighting a battle with digital downloads and movies ordered directly to set-top boxes. But ironically, the biggest competition has still been from hard copy DVDs. Companies like Netflix, which post DVDs directly to a viewer's door, saving them that trip to the store. Now to the top of the world, the Arctic, and word is it may contain 90 billion barrels of oil and almost 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Not surprising then that Russia, the US, Canada, Norway and Denmark all want in. We're going to focus on Denmark, as its claim comes from its administration of Greenland, where one oil company says it may have found some of these precious oil deposits. Nazanin Mashiri travelled to Greenland to see if the find was welcomed by the locals.
There's a quiet sense of excitement here in Aasiaat. This sleepy fishing town on Greenland's west coast could be on the verge of something extraordinary. 150 kilometres out at sea, Cairn Energy, a Scottish company, has found traces of oil. There could be more of the black stuff here than in the North Sea. Most locals welcome Cairn Energy's presence. An oil-wealthy Greenland could transform the economy.
From my point of view, I really don't care if it's going to be found in the south or it's going to be found here, because it will benefit the whole Greenland.
For environmentalists, Arctic drilling is too much of a risk. There are drifting icebergs and oil degrades more slowly in freezing waters. A Gulf of Mexico type spill would be even more disastrous here. Greenpeace campaigners recently scaled one of the rigs in a tense standoff with the company. There are bound to be future similar confrontations. Greenland's premier, a critic of Greenpeace, is fully behind the oil investment. He told me every precaution is being taken.
We are not drilling at deep water. We are sticking to the best practices. We are sticking to best available technology. And also we have all the world's attention on us.
Some fear the oil rush will bring an influx of big multinationals, and the damage to Inuit society could be irreparable.
Yes, Greenland has a chance to be rich. On the other hand, we also have the risk to be a minority in our own country.
It may already be too late. The world started arriving not just in Greenland, but throughout the Arctic. And it's not just oil they're after. The search is on for gold, diamonds and many other treasures. The Arctic could become a new global power. Not only will it have vast oil and gas reserves as well as fresh water, but also climate change will lead to new shipping routes, allowing direct trade between the Atlantic and the Far East. Some are calling this area the New North.
Now, just a quick note before we go. On last week's show, we had so much good feedback on it. Something about the contrast between big military spending on the one hand and everyday people's struggles on the other really seemed to strike a chord. If you didn't see it, head to aljazeera.net/English, hit the business tab at the top, which will lead you to the Counting the Cost page. You can see that episode, which is rolling now, and all our others as well. Please keep your comments coming in as well. On Twitter, we added a bunch more followers this last week. Always keen for more, at AJ Counting Cost, the name to look for. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. 1 year exactly since I took over the seat, so thank you for watching and all that time. I'm Kamal Santamaria on behalf of the whole team. See you next time.